some kind of costume and play the fool or singing or something. So it's odd for me to be on the floor. But anyway, let's get on with this. What I'm here for, although I can't remember a single thing that I'm going to talk about. But when I first say to people, say for instance this poppy, they say, what's that for? And you say the Canary-Girls. And they go, what? Who are they? And you begin to tell them a little bit about the Canary-Girls, and they are surprised. They're really very surprised. And so was I. In fact, I've always been interested in women's social history, right back from when I was in college 400 years ago. And I didn't realise that somebody had to make all these bullets and shells. It never occurred to me. I thought everything came from China, doesn't it? Anyway, so really, I think when I really got interested in women's war work was in 2018, not 1918, because I wasn't around, the year after. So in 2018, we had the commemoration of the end of the First World War. And in our parish church, we put on a display, and I was part of it. I helped out. Also, I've been reading a book by Kate Adie called Sits to Camouflage. It's a very good book. She wrote it a long time ago. In fact, she's written lots of books about women's war. But this really piqued my interest. And then we had a speaker drop out, as they do occasionally, for our OWI here at Sedbergh. And so I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll do a talk on women at war. I normally do a quiz, so it made a challenge. Anyway, I did this talk about women at war, and mainly it was based around the women who dressed up as chaps to be soldiers. Joan Bart wasn't the only one, so I found out there were hundreds of them. And they often weren't found out until perhaps they were wounded or they died. So that was interesting, but there was a chapter in there about the munitions workers. It was a one square meal and a yellow face. So that was one of the straplines they were using to get women to come and work in munitions. But I still didn't really take it on board. But then I started to begin to read about these women and found out that there was nearly 1 million of them in both world wars, and probably 2 million if you consider all the different subsidiaries that fed those munitions. Women were working in smelting as well, making the bullets, as well as filling them, and especially making the cordite explosive that goes in them. So, let's just go back in time for a little while. So here we are. These are 4 young ladies who are working in domestic service. Now, they're very, very young, apart from the one in the middle. They're probably in their teens, and they have the most awful jobs, really. And we're talking about 1912, 1914, around there. And around then, also the suffragettes were getting going. Now, I've got a feeling that these young women, and women like them working in the mills and factories, might have gone to one of these, which is Suffragette Rally. Now they happen all over the country. This one in particular is in Leeds. Now you imagine you're a domestic servant, or you're working long hours in the mill for tons only, because the men got paid for only, but you only got tons. And you saw this and you listened to what they were saying, you might have felt empowered. And in fact, they did feel empowered, and women did strike in factories and mills. It didn't do them any good because the unions were always on the side of the men. Now let's see where I've got to. Okay, so in the lead up to the First World War, the newspapers didn't say very much about it at all because, well, we were a bit arrogant, weren't we? So when war broke out in 1914, everyone was quite surprised. Not only were they surprised, they were very gung-ho about it. You have to remember, ladies, I'm sure you're gentlemen as well, sorry I forgot. Where's your frock? Surely you're not wearing that. So they were very gung-ho, because I'm sure you remember that all the map, practically all the world map was pink when we were at school, because it was our empire. So everybody was dead gung ho, you know, we can win the war, and we'll win it by Christmas. So that's what they hoped for, but I don't think that came about. So the next thing they had to do to win this war, even if it wasn't over by Christmas, was to recruit men. And then you see this iconic poster, which I'm sure you all recognise, Lord Kitchener and Your Country Needs You. So he was up there saying to the men, come on. And they did. They had no television, no radio, so they put big halls like this, or they'd stand up in the marketplace and they would recruit men to come and fight for their nation's honour. And they did in their droves. Agricultural labourers, men from factories, men from all sorts of industries, and from service as well. So they were looking for a bit of adventure. They went happily away with people cheering, and blah. Well, time went on, and 1915 dawns, and the factories producing shells didn't have many workers left in them. So that the amount of shells far outstripped the needs of shells on the front far outstripped the amount that the workers could produce, because there was such a lessened workforce in these factories. They did produce some, but actually the boys at the front were rationed on their bullets and rationed on their shells. So something had to be done. The papers got hold of this, and they called it the shell scandal in 1915. And it was a scandal, and everyone was up in arms about it. They were disgusted to think that the boys out there were facing bullets and couldn't fire any. And so, what did they do? Well, Lloyd George, pictured here in the bowler out next to Churchy, he was made Minister of Munitions. And one of the first things he did was to, I wish I'd remember to turn his things over. I've done this before, never mind. Right, what I love lacking skill, I make up for in enthusiasm. So anyway, he was made Minister of Munitions, and one of the first things he did was have a Munitions Act passed as part of the Defence of the Realm Act, known as DORA. So this was a far-reaching act which meant censorship, military rule. Basically, we were under military rule, which is why letters like that went out to women and men to come and work. And one of the key powers was that he was able to commandeer factories and turn them over into making munitions, because they were desperate. Also, buying up land to build factories. And one of the biggest factories that was built was at Gretna. But if you're going to build a huge factory that was 9 miles long by 2 miles wide, the biggest factory in the world, as Karen said, then you're going to have people to fill it. Now, where are these people going to come from if all the chaps are out fighting? Guess? Okay, so then we see these posters on the streets. And again, no radio, no TV, so rallies would be held in village halls, town halls, marketplaces. So the first one there is Women Are Doing Their Bit, Learn to Make Munitions. And she's putting her coat on, and behind her, Tommy Atkins is going out with his gun. So no emotional blackmail whatsoever. Women are working night and day to win the war. They're asking for your money as well as your time, so there's women working away there to make munitions. And the one in the middle that really is a smack in the mouth, isn't it? That on her, their lives depend. I think that is a very important phrase which we should bear in mind, because this is true. If the women hadn't gone and done their duty, if you like, then maybe there would have been a lot more losses in the First World War, and there were quite enough, if you ask me. Right, so okay, so they're recruiting women, and one of the strap lines they used to recruit women was, come along, this is a healthy and pleasant occupation. Exactly. And factory conditions are ideal. But the factory conditions might have been ideal in a big, newly built factory like Gretna, and other factories around the country, because that wasn't the only one. But the hostels where the girls were housed were not. And actually they had no running water to start with, and they had no toilets. They had a trench at the back of the hospitals or buckets, and in fact in the factory floors, that's where they had buckets. They really were not treated well. But if you think about it, they had to get into production immediately. So there was nothing else for it. So 12,000 women went to Gretna, and that's an aerial view of it. You can see all the factory buildings there, and around the outside there was hospitals. And actually it looked really idyllic from the outside of the hospitals, but inside they were all given, well, less space than that for their bed and their little cabinet and wash basin. So they really didn't have much at all. And at first they had to go and feed themselves outside of the factory, but they realised that this wasn't particularly efficient, and so after a while they had factory canteens. So here we are, here's the young ladies unloading gun cotton. Now gun cotton is what you need to make your explosives. And this gun cotton was washed out and ready, and then it was mixed with nitroglycerine and amyl and other various chemicals. One that they used in the beginning was called oilamum or something. It's O-E-L-U-M, if anyone can pronounce it better, fine. But that was too expensive, so they experimented with other things, and they hit on a derivative of ammonia, and they used that with it. So this is the girls mixing up the devil's porridge. Now, they've got gun cotton, nitroglycerine and other chemicals. They're mixing it away by hand, and the fumes from this stuff would make them feel drunk and dizzy and fall over. So they have to go outside for a while to get over it. We rather think, and Judith at the Devil's Porridge agrees with me, that maybe this was the reason why they got a reputation for being drunk. It wasn't actually that they were drunk, they were just overcome by these fumes. And Sir Arthur Coleman Doyle visited this factory in Gretna in 1916, and he was a war correspondent, and it was him who christened it the Devil's Porridge. And he said, there they are, these smiling, khaki-clad young women, mixing away at this explosives, seemingly unaware that they could be blown to atoms at any minute. So, let's see, without my glasses, I'm doing well, aren't I? Okay, another factory that they built was at Rotherworth, which is in Hereford. And, oh, there's the cordite, by the way, which is what happens to the Devil's Porridge once it's dried out. They make it into cords, and then it's easier to ship around the country. And one of the places it was shipped to was Rotherworth in Rotherworth in Hereford. So there's a young lady there, and hundreds of them there, filling up shells. And this young lady's filling the big ones with explosives. She's also placing the detonator inside, and she has to put that in, and it has to be really packed around with explosives. Then she has to put a screw top on it. It's very dangerous work, and there were explosions at all the factories around and about. And 17,000 women worked in the Rotherworth factory, and by 1917 they were turning out 70 to 90,000 shells a week. And Gretna was turning out 800 tons of cordite a week. So they really did work very hard. So I can't see what I've got on here. Oh yes, here's another factory, Chilwell. Oh no, there's the Rotherworth million shells. Oh, they're marvellous. As this would be a publicity photo, you can see a number of you like. This would be a publicity photo, but it's marvellous, isn't it? All those shells. Gosh, what a waste. And what have we got next? Oh yes, these two. These are the two furnace workers. You can't get many pictures that are off the net, they won't let you have them, but this one I thought was great. Two furnace workers. They're actually smelting the metal to make the bullets. And because more and more men were going away as we get towards 1917, you get more and more women doing more hard work jobs or dirty jobs that men would have done. But they had to go. So, where are we? I can't even see. Oh, yes. we're going to Chilwell. Here's the Chilwell High Flyers. Now, if you can work out what them women are doing out there, I wish you would tell me, because I haven't got a clue. But the men are standing on the floor watching. So I don't know if they went along and it went down and picked up the shells or whatever. But this is 1970, and this next picture is a reminder of what would happen. So that was Chilwell in 1918, and that explosion went on for 3 days, and 130 odd people were killed, and many more were injured, hundreds were injured. If you look anything up on the net, you will find that records differ. Some say this many, some say that many, some even say different dates. But I don't know. I have done my best to find out what the average is. Now, this happened, and as I say, no, not that one. After second. So this happened, and all these explosions went on, and for miles around, windows were blown out. And they didn't rebuild it. But people, eyewitnesses said they saw people running from this explosion with their clothes on fire and their faces blackened, and some just kept running until they actually collapsed of exhaustion. It was really a very sad occasion. And moving on, there's another sad occasion, and we have Elsie here, who's come to tell us all about it. Come out, Elsie.
Do I look right, Sandra?
You look fabulous, doesn't she, girl?
My name is Elsie, and I worked at the old Bunnerman factory at Silvertown in London's East End. It had been taken over by the government for making munitions. I well remember the day the sky turned red. It was a few minutes before 7, January 19, 1917. People came out of their doors to watch the fire, not realising the terrible danger they were in. All at once, everything exploded with a deafening roar. Flames went up high into the sky, and there was destruction over the whole district. Hundreds of people lost their homes. Whole streets turned to rubble. It was shocking. More than 500 people, including many children, were injured, and 73 were killed. Everyone said it was an accident waiting to happen, and they said it was bad to have something so dangerous in the middle of our community.
Thank you. And so, just to cheer us up a little, let's have a picture closer to home. There we are, thanks to Auckland workers in the canteen. And there was a big explosion there too, but they're in the canteen today. And you can see just how many of them there are. It's incredible, isn't it? It's very hard to get decent pictures of the interweb, but I do know this. Okay, so where are we now? Ah, yes. So you now know how I got involved with this and all the things I found out and continue to find out about what happened to these women in the First World War and how they were so overlooked and forgotten mainly. And this picture, this next picture, is the part, I cry every time. It's the one picture that I just could never get out of my mind. Because they're so young, they're between 18 and under, and they're all working in this munitions place, but there's no danger, of course. And the one guy upsets, the one in the middle, looks just like my daughter, and she agreed, it does look like her. And even more so, there's my granddaughter right in the front, in the white. My granddaughter's right. I tell you what, there are people's faces there that I recognise, and I'm sure that if you take a closer look over there, you will too. And it is something that really touched me, and I want so much to get these women recognised. So okay, moving on, we have the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s. Well, in 1918, women did get the vote, but they had to be over 30 and they had to own property. which was a little unfair on the unwashed poor, wasn't it? But also, as the time moved on, in 1928, all women got the vote. Hooray, thank goodness for that. Which led then into the 1930s, where there was a lot of labour unrest because men wanted their jobs and women were out of work in a lot of cases. And there was the Jarrow March, and then the Depression. And I don't really know how the country got through it, but somehow it did. And then what happened? Unbelievably, that's a woman voting in 1928. Yes, I forgot, didn't I? That's what happened. So we have another war. Can you actually believe that after the First World War, there's another war? And it was ignored for a long time. Every politician, everybody in the country did everything they could to get peace, to keep peace. But in the end, unfortunately, war was declared. And so recruitment of men took place, but the interesting thing this time is that we had a good standing army and we had a territorial army that could be called up. We had a good navy, a well-equipped navy, and we also had the Baby Air Force, which would come into its own, of course, during this war. So we weren't unprepared as we were in the First World War. So with all the men joining up and going away again, we have to recruit women to make the shells. Well, this is going to happen, isn't it? It's exactly the same situation. Bullets are needed. So the next one is, of course, another recruitment campaign for girls and women. And about this time, again, there's radio, so there would have been radio advertisements and talks on the radio, no doubt using every form of emotional blackmail they could. Your children are safe in the country, so come and work in the munitions factory, and so on. And so, fighting fit in the factory, come along, we can do it. And yes, there were women shipbuilders, but that's an American poster. I couldn't find one that's British. But we all recognise it, Rosie the Riveter, don't we? The women shipbuilders I've seen didn't look like her. So the one in the middle will be the most familiar one. It will be on the streets. There'll be the same, this sort of place. You'd be invited to come along. There'd be a rally to get you to be recruited. The difference this time is that the women who were going to sign up to be munitions workers probably had mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers who had worked in munitions in the First World War. And so they were much better prepared and they understood the dangers. So in my book, that probably makes them even braver because they knew what it was about and they'd seen women with injuries, with hands blown off and so forth. Because that was a lot of the injuries were hands, fingers, eyes, blindness, and also scarring from the serious heat and the chemicals in what they were mixing up. So women again, Ernest Bevan, he was the Minister of Labour I think at the time, and he asked for 1 million women to come, and so they did. And there they are, they're all going to the Woolwich Arsenal there to work. There was a number of explosions there too. And going back to the Roosevelt factory, that never closed down. Interestingly enough, it carried on making munitions up to the Second World War and of course during it. So somebody must have had an idea something was going to happen. Also, I can't read the writing here. Also, there was the Aycliffe site, which is at County Durham, and that was a huge one, and I know that you have told me about your angel. Yes, I know that bit. I mean the person,
What's Lady in Broth?
a lady in Broth. She worked there, did she?
No.
A mum worked there. Magic. So the Aycliffe site was in County Durham, and it was newly built because they had sold off the Gretna site, piecemeal, so that no longer existed, and they had to have a huge factory. Yes,
would just like to say I'm here to represent my friend, Julia. She was 100 in August this year, and she was an April angel.
Oh, bless.
And she, I've got photographs of her here, and and she's been on television, and they've actually got a plaque in Native Village in County Durham.
Yes.
But she was only native for 2 years, I think, but she was promoted and sent down to Staffordshire, stuck on Staffordshire. So there must have been one there as well.
Oh, yes.
She has
There
given
were
me the name of
hundreds.
it, but I haven't got it at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
But she's had quite a lot of publicity. So.
Yes, I mean, there is publicity about this, and quite a bit of it they've released, but there are things that they haven't done. Anyway, as you so rightly said, the Oakland Angels, but we'll come back to them in a minute, because there was factories in Liverpool, and we have a young lady called Gwen who's coming along to tell us what it was like to work there.
There was no training. You just went to small areas called shops where they made different sized shells and landmines. It was heavy work. There was this thing like a big cement mixer, which was full of hot TNT, which would be tipped up so you could fill your can and take it back to your workstation. The smell was terrible. Once I slipped on the floor with one of these big cans and I was covered in TNT. My eyes sealed up, it was up my nose, it was everywhere. Some of the chaps that were working there got hold of me and put me on a trolley and took me down to the medical place. I had to wait for the TNT to set on my face before attempting to get it off. I had quite a job, and of course my face was red and scarred from the hot TNT. They left me on the bed for an hour, and then it was straight back to work.
I think that really brings it home to you how hard these women worked. And really, they didn't complain either. Now let's go back to Aiken, which we have a picture of here. You'll notice that you can hardly see the sheds this time if you compare it with the Gretna side. The reason being is we now had an air force, and so did the Nazis. So bombs could hit there, and also if one production shed blew up, it wouldn't harm the others, so production could continue. So it was a very difficult balance to keep the work going and to protect the women who worked there. And in fact, there were a number of underground factories during the Second World War. I have tried to find out all sorts of stuff, and there are records of all the women who worked in the Second World War and of their injuries, etc. But you can't find them out. And I did actually try, and I got access denied. Interesting. So if MI6 come and get me in a minute. Okay. So here we have Oakland Factory, and here we have a real Oakland angel. Bless her. This is Phoebe Moore, and she was killed in 1942 along with 3 other women. So sad. There she is, her two little girls and her husband who's in the Navy. And of course, the Oakland angel came from Lord Warburton, propagandist in the Second World War, who used to threaten the factory girls with bombings, and he called them the Oakland Angels because he said that's what they soon would be. But anyway, it didn't deter them, because we're made of stern stuff, aren't we? So here we are now. I don't know what the next one is. Oh yes, right, this is what is called. Nancy, who worked at the Rosenwald factory in Hereford, and she was saying that the Nazi bombers came so low that she could see the swastika. We have tried to get the sound to be louder, but we failed. And we're not alone. We had one of these IT clever persons, and he couldn't get it to work. So there you go. So that was quite comforting, really. So I'm sorry. So I'll tell you, it was Nancy Billington. She worked at the Rosenwald factory in the Second World War, and she was involved in an explosion there. And she says the Nazi bomber came so low they could actually see the swastika. And her friend said to her, friend Betty said, "Cover your face, Nancy, cover your face." And she did, and then the whole shed exploded. Now there were 30 women in this shed, and she and Betty were the only ones to get out. And she also mentions the girl that she was working with, whose name hasn't been mentioned, but she was working with her, and the girl said, because this was 6 o'clock in the morning, they'd just finished a night shift, said to her, "Oh, Nancy, I could sleep forever." Well, she did, because she was one of them who didn't get out. Terribly sad, and it chokes me up every time. Now here we have the National Memorial Arboretum in Lichfield in Staffordshire. Hands up all those who have been. Yay! Me too. Wonderful place, beautiful place. And this memorial you can see is one of the central memorials, and that is to honour all the people who have been killed since the Second World War. So it honours women soldiers and so forth. And it's really the most moving thing to stand there without crying. I don't know. And I've been to the battlefields in France, in Ypres, in Holland, I've been to Arnhem, I've been to Tegel and to Tyne-Pot, everywhere. I've been to Japan, where there's a beautiful garden remembrance there for all the soldiers of all nations. I've been to all those places, and still I don't see anything for women. And unfortunately, it's the same here, except in recent times, the Timber Jewels and the Land Army have their memorial, and there's a picture down there of them. Also, another wonderful thing about it is, at last, there's a memorial for those shot at dawn. Now, whatever you think, that I don't think they were cowards, I just think they were poor little boys who couldn't take it. And I'm sure I would have been one of them, because I certainly wouldn't have been able to stand it. And I'm glad there's a memorial for them, because it was terribly sad that they lost their lives in the way that they did. There's no counselling in those days. There's also a magnificent memorial to the parachute regiment. Oh, it's fantastic. But there's also one to the horses. Now, horses were used in the First World War, of course, and we forget about them. You might have seen war horse running along the trenches. Well, it couldn't have run along the trenches because none of them were straight. But it makes a nice film. But all these horses that worked so hard all through the war, all through the First World War, were all shot because they didn't bring them home. Now, I can't quite come to terms with that, but there you go. But they have a memorial. There's even one to dogs and pigeons, bless them. But there isn't one to our 2 million dearly munition workers, the Canary-Girls. And that is my mission. And I will chain this dog to the railings outside Parliament in the summer. Anyone who wants to join me, please do. Because I really think that women's social history is missing a big part. And also, these women need to be honoured. If we don't let the past inform the future, then we're missing something, aren't we? And there's a whole generations of young women who need to know about the women who did this really hard work. If you look online, there is mountains of information, but there's still no memorial. I have had a meeting with Andy Lassell at the Memorial Arboretum, and we have had a talk, and I've got all the forms and everything, had a really good meeting with him. And when I showed him this, which is our proposed memorial, he let out a little gasp. He was so amazed that we were so well prepared. But we are so lucky because amongst our trustees we have an architect, bless her heart, and she of course did this. Now, the good thing about it is that it can be made in parts. So, in other words, we can do the ground part, everything has to be porous. It must be porous and it must be easy to maintain. So, we can put the ground down, we can put benches, we can put one of the flats at the back, and we can add to it, which means that the way we gather pennies together to do it can happen over time. So it's really marvellous, and I'm so glad you all came. Before I finish, I will just read you a little poem, for which I shall have to get the necessary equipment. Yes, there we are. See, there's no way I can do anything without this. Right. Now this poem was written by William Golding. Now you might have heard him, he did Lord of the Flies, among other things. So, he says, I think women are foolish to pretend they are equal to men. They are far superior and always have been. Whatever you give a woman, she will make it greater. If you give her sperm, she will give you a baby. Give her a house and she will give you a home. Give her groceries and she will give you a meal. Give her a smile and she will give you her heart. She multiplies and enlarges whatever is given to her. So if you give her crap, be prepared to receive a ton of. Any questions? Yes, Steve?
So what was the response of is this going to be actually happening at the National Art Week?
Well, we have one major sticking point, the slowness of the Charity Commission. Now, Eric Martler, you might know him, he was MP for Carlisle for some time, he's now in the House of Lords. His mother was a munition worker, and he has set up a television interview for me at the Devil's Porridge. I've got radio interviews waiting, but all of them are reliant upon us having charitable status. And we waited, nearly 3 months, maybe more now, and still nothing's happened. That's the fires going out. Sorry, ladies. Well, that's holes in the road out the front there is for central heating. Whoopie doozy, we come into the 21st century at last. I can't wait. But yes, so that's what we're waiting for. That's the hold up. Because once we have that, we can have our own Poppy Day or Black Day, whatever we choose to call it. We can go online and get just crowdfunding and just giving and stuff like that. But until we are a bona fide charity, we can't do that. I really was expecting it sooner than this, and as I say, chaining myself to the railings will happen, I assure you. But when the weather's better. So, is there any more questions? Yes, my dear?
Do you mind if I offload a few memories on you? My wife and I were born during the Blitz in 1940, brought up in County Durham, and I remember the bombers coming over, bombing the area, and we, getting back to the subject, we inherited a refugee from the south coast who lived with us and worked at the Aycliffe factory. We were from Durham City, and so that was our first connection with Aycliffe, the factory. Her son, while she was living with us, her son was killed in the tank regiment while she worked in the war. So that was the first connection. The main connection was that when I was 16, I joined the police in Durham County, and just after the war, the factory at Aycliffe became the police headquarters. I don't know whether you knew that.
No,
it became the police headquarters, and the whole police system operated in Durham from Aycliffe factory. It became the police headquarters. And I was recruited there as a police cadet in 1956. Served my time in Durham County and worked a lot within that factory. And you could tell it what it would be because at the back were mounds of earth which were really rich shelters, which had gone out and was near it, a hive or a shelter. And then, of course, in recent years, we befriended a girl, a lady, who was 100 about 2 weeks ago, who was an Aycliffe angel. And she got a lot of publicity in the press and on the telly. She's still communicated to my wife who worked with her immediately. So she knows it very well. She was naked baby.
No.
So I was recruited to the police actually in the factory. It became the police headquarters.
No. Anyone else? Yes, David?
I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the canary yellow thing. I might have missed it, but why exactly did it came canary yellow? Did a lot of them die, or were there long-term effects?
Yes, I'm afraid so. There's up on the board there, it shows you was done. The government actually knew it was toxic, but their backs were against the wall too. It causes all sorts of things, it even brings on fits, epileptic fits. It gets into the skin and down the throat, and the oleum that I mentioned was like a black powder or ammonium stuff, and it's like a black powder. If that got in your throat and everything, you just burnt it away, and women died of that. But the yellow colour was simply because of the chemicals going into the skin. And the government at the time did say that there was no harm, and yet there are records of women dying of TNT poisoning long after. But the records are not there to be seen. There's also, I've been told, a lot of birth defects and stillborn babies, which were born yellow as well. So yeah, there is just a mountain of information about this.
So will the Freedom of Information Act not allow you to find anything?
Well, as I say, the Imperial War Museum are working with the government to get the records of all the women who worked. And that way we might be able to see how some of them died or what some of them died of. But this TNT mixture was carcinogenic, there's no question about it. But of course some women survive to be 100, and some die very quickly. I suppose it depends on your genes and possibly how you were brought up, whether you were extremely poor and lived in poverty and perhaps you weren't all that healthy to start with. But yes, that was the reason. And of course their hair went in different colours too, yellow, orange and green. And they were considered to be rather loose women in the Second World War because they used to wear pancake makeup to cover up the yellow, and their hair was like they dyed it, and only ladies of the night did that. So they had to deal with a bad reputation, and also people didn't know what they were doing because they weren't allowed to say. They had to say it remained secret. Okay, all right.
I think that you've engendered so many questions. I'm sure lots of people will come up afterwards and ask you that. But thank you, Sandra. It was an interesting afternoon, wasn't it? I mean, we've seen pictures of people firing the bullets and the shells. It didn't actually enter my head. It's not there for a name. And so many people. It's wonderful, really. If any of you got a chance to go to the Forest Museum at Gretna, do go, because it's really interesting. Sandra told us a lot about it, but it's worth going, isn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Definitely.
Most definitely. Yeah, and of course the Arboretum is stunning. Yeah, stunning. And so you can get a little train to go around, so
Well, it'll be wonderful if you get your, I'm sure you will, get your
memorial,
and then we'll all go and see it.
yes,
Because it is incredible to think of the thousands and thousands of ladies who work, who are just not remembered, not in their own reason. Thank you very much. Your enthusiasm is wonderful, and it was a very interesting afternoon. Thank you.